Hello citizens and welcome back. In today's video, I want to take a closer look at the money circulation in Star Citizen's economy and why are CAG concerned about inflation. As always, if you like this video, sacrifice a like and a comment to the YouTube algorithm and subscribe for more. And here's a shout out to our amazing patrons for their support of the channel and the Armory. At CitizenCon this year, CAG talked about their plans for Star Citizen's economy for the 1.0 release. I will have separate videos coming out for various parts of that panel, but CAG said one very interesting thing. Paraphrasing what was said, when players have too many credits, it causes inflation. So we need to find ways to take credits away from players. Now, every part of that statement is true. But what's important is that CAG are showing a lot of understanding of the concept and seem to be trying to learn from other games that experienced inflation. But before we get into how this impacts Star Citizen, I think we need to take a moment to explain some of the basic concepts, which sadly involves a lesson in economics and delving into the insane world of monetary policy. So I think that most of us are very familiar with the existence of inflation and what it does to the world around us. We can observe that things get more expensive, meaning that we can buy less with the money we have. Now, why is that? Well, generally speaking, as an economy grows, the output increases, which means that there are more goods in circulation. Assuming that demand stays the same or rises slower than the volume of available goods, this will lead to deflation. In other words, prices will decrease. Now, this sounds like a good thing, right? Well, for the consumer, yes. For the economy, no. And it's for two main reasons. First, if prices are decreasing, consumers might delay purchases expecting prices to drop further, which could result in businesses having to cut back production and could trigger a recession in the worst case. Second, as the economy grows, there are more transactions happening. These transactions require money. If there is not enough money in the circulation, it becomes more difficult to carry out these transactions on time. But more importantly, borrowing money becomes very expensive, meaning that interest rates rise. So people and businesses can't borrow money to grow. And this is bad. So central banks, through various means, inject fresh money into the economy to keep the system stable. But the world is a complicated place and this doesn't always work. So what happens if too much money is injected into the economy? Well, suddenly you have more money trying to purchase the same amount of goods, which causes demand to rise, which causes the prices to rise. If the prices rise, it means that people are losing their purchasing power, so they need more money to maintain their current standard of living. And this might result in workers looking for higher wages, which increases the cost of doing business, which increases prices, which results in further inflation. And this goes on until the central bank does something about it or the economy crashes because the currency is next to worthless. Fortunately, central banks have a lot of tools at their disposal to control inflation and maintain it at an acceptable level. And for the most part, these tools actually work. The problem is that the world is unpredictable and sometimes things happen that completely break this mechanism and it takes us years to find balance again. For example, most of the world is still recovering from the economic impacts of the pandemic. So congratulations, you managed to sit through me trying to find use for my economics degree. But now let's get back to Star Citizen. Why is this even a problem for us? Well, players in Star Citizen generate resources and credits. Resources get consumed by crafting or they get sold for credits. Now the problem is that technically there is an infinite amount of credits and resources in the system. Since resources have a few obvious sinks, the problem there is not that big. But with credits, this is a massive issue that we're seeing even now, especially when an exploit is found and players generate billions of credits overnight. But that doesn't quite explain why inflation is a problem that Star Citizen might face. So let's step back and remember what we talked about a moment ago. If the amount of credits in the circulation is higher than the amount of resources available, it will cause demand to rise and the corresponding increase in prices. And I think that it's reasonable to think that given how many resource sinks there are, we might find ourselves in a situation where there aren't enough resources in the circulation, which is actually not a bad thing when it happens locally. On a small scale, a price increase of certain resources can actually stimulate the economy by opening up trade and extraction opportunities. But on a global scale, this is a problem. Also, you can't forget that not every player will make credits by generating resources. Some players will be mercenaries or bounty hunters or traders and haulers. All of these professions don't generate any resources. They mostly consume them, but they still generate credits that they want to spend on fuel, supplies, and items. And some players have a habit of hoarding money. All of this can create inflation as all of these players try to buy mostly the same amount of items and resources. But if everyone has more credits, it doesn't matter that things get more expensive, right? Well, for long-time players that would be somewhat true. As they complete more advanced content, they will earn more credits and will be able to afford the increased cost. However, players who play less frequently or prefer to live in more remote areas of the verse might find themselves at a disadvantage. They will have fewer opportunities to earn credits and thus might not be able to afford items. And the same applies to new players. So, how can this be fixed? Well, you could increase the amount of resources and items in the system. But how? Assuming that StarSim is still going to include quanta that try to balance the economy, CAG could use this to add more resources and items into the circulation. But currently we don't know if this feature is still included in StarSim. The other option is to decrease the amount of credits that are in circulation. This has some additional challenges. We already mentioned the first. In theory, there are infinite credits in circulation in Star Citizen. There is no central bank that tracks this and actively intervenes. There are no loans, interest rates, or other financial instruments, which effectively removes most monetary policy tools we know from real life. So first, I think we need to define which credits we consider to be in circulation. In our case, it makes the most sense to only count credits that are owned by the players. You could, in theory, track the current balance for each of the NPC factions and guilds, but I feel like that's a bit too complicated and doesn't really give us much benefit. But also, splitting all available credits this way actually makes it much easier to deal with inflation. We simply have to remove credits from players. And that very nicely brings us back to money sinks. We have a few of those in-game already. Fines, impound costs, and ship insurance claim expedition. All of these are reliable ways to take credits away from players. Automated cargo loading is a very good example as well since you have to pay for it. Now you might ask if item purchases are a money sink. And technically they are. Though I would argue that the player is getting some value back and by buying that item you're also consuming some resources. But all of this is not really enough. We need to introduce more ways to remove credits from circulation. And that's where taxes come in. Now you have to remember that in real life when you pay taxes, the money doesn't disappear from circulation. The government spends it somewhere and it eventually makes its way back to the people. For example, you pay your taxes and the government takes that money to pay for a new highway to be built. So a portion of that money will become the salary of the construction workers, who will then pay taxes on that income and around it goes. But in Star Citizen, if a player doesn't have the credits, it's as if they didn't exist. So while there potentially is an infinite amount of credits, in reality the amount is finite. At CitizenCon, CAG specifically talked about the inheritance tax and regeneration payments. We know that eventually our characters will only be able to regenerate so many times before they fully die. So not only will the regeneration cost us something, but once our characters fully die, we will lose some of our credits to the inheritance tax. This is actually very smart, because it allows CAG to charge a percentage of your current credit balance or net worth. which means that new players won't be punished with harsh costs and taxes, and veteran players won't be getting off easy with low payments. However, some players might be able to stay alive and not lose their character very often. So we need to introduce ways to make players pay credits for simply existing and doing stuff. Which may sound harsh, but it's true, but it also needs to be balanced so it's not too punishing. One such example would be insurance costs. They are promised to be low enough so we can always afford them, but they will inherently take credits away from players periodically. And it's actually a very smart way to take credits away from players who avoid death and thus avoid paying the inheritance tax. CAG also talked about the land tax in UEE systems. This essentially grants you protection of your land if it's on a planet controlled by a UEE, but more on that in a separate video. They could also introduce other small taxes and payments. For example, trade tariffs when importing goods from other star systems, or even cargo manipulation costs and hangar fees. And my favorite, licensing costs for blueprints. And if you don't know what I mean by that, that's okay. I will explain in the next week's video. The point is, they will fine you and take your credits and inflation will be no more. So, can you avoid taxes in Star Citizen? It's an interesting question, and depending on how crafting works, I'm leaning towards yes. You could technically live completely off-grid in a lawless system. This would exempt you from paying taxes on your land claim. You could also harvest or craft everything you need to survive instead of buying it, which would save you from paying trade tariffs and such. If you didn't have a ship, you would also avoid paying insurance as well. But that would essentially make you a nomadic settler of whatever planet you choose to do this on, which might be appealing to a few people, but most players in Star Citizen probably want to experience the main story or any of the gameplay loops we have instead. But is it possible? Probably yes. And with that being said, that's all for today. What do you think? Will taxes help us prevent inflation in Star Citizen? What other methods can CAG implement to fix this issue? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, fly safe, and I will see you in the verse.